Okay, we're on. Well, welcome everybody, and we're going to have a lot of fun tonight. This is going to be a relaxed period of time. We're going to watch some spots, and then we're going to hear from three of the great commentators, political commentators in America who are here. I'm Dan Glickman, director of the Institute of Politics. I myself ran for Congress 10 times, lost the last time. I won the first 9 times, which is 90%, which isn't bad, I guess, but I only remember the last time. We have in the audience, by the way, Congressman Dan Miller from Florida, who is up here. He and his wife are here. It's a pleasure to welcome them here as well. But anyway, we're going to try to find out who, first of all, a couple questions. Do you care who wins the elections? And if so, then we want to know who will win the elections. So I'm going to introduce the panel first, and then we're going to show a couple of spots at the beginning. But on my left, from CNN's Capital Gang and Inside Politics, and Time Magazine's Public Eye, she is the first female columnist in the history of Time Magazine, mind you. I wanted to introduce Margaret Carlson, a veteran reporter of 4 presidential campaigns. Margaret? From 1997 to 1992, she was Chief of Staff to the Minority Whip of the U.S. House, Tom DeLay, and she was named by National Journal and Roll Call magazine as one of the top Hill staffers. She is now a partner of one of the 10 law firms in Washington, D.C., Williams & Jensen, and we were delighted to have our own IOP fellow, Susan Hirschman. And finally, we are joined by a gentleman who got his Ph.D. from my alma mater, and aside from Harvard, the finest institution in America, the University of Michigan. He is currently a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's director of the Transition to Governing Project. He is one of the leading political scientists in America. We're delighted to have with us one of the top political scholars in America, Norm Ornstein. This week, our political system was shocked by the tragic plane crash that killed Senator Paul Wellstone, his wife, his family, much of his family, and 2 pilots. Because of the nature of the timing of this, and to some extent it's difficult to do this at a time that he just passed away, but I think he would appreciate the fact that we're keeping the political system alive. So I want to show a few video clips that illustrate the passion that Paul Wellstone brought to politics, the way he worked for the poor and disadvantaged, and the enthusiasm he generated in young people. And regardless of your views on his particular ideology or his politics, the fact that he was the kind of person that really believed that politics was the finest profession. So Anne-Marie, can we show these clips? The first is from, it's an ad which is a spoof on Roger and Me from his 1990 Senate campaign against Rudy Boschwitz. The second is a clip from Nightline that really demonstrates his energy. And the third is from an MSNBC report about the memorial service held in his honor last night. So let's run the tape.
Decided to run for Senate, there was one thing I was looking forward to. So as it turns out, were a lot of you.
Well, I expect that there will be some debates.
I'd love to see a debate with him.
Well, I think there should be debates, yeah.
Some people have more money than others to play with, and where if you debate, you're kind of standing there without money.
Getting a hold of the person I had to debate, however, proved easier said than done.
Is Rudy Boschwitz here? No, he's not. You don't want me to go in? No, we don't like strangers walking around.
First, I tried his campaign headquarters.
Then let me give you my home phone number, too, okay?
Sure. I'll make sure that he gets this, and we'll get back to you.
What do you think? Do you think we should have debates around the state? So that people can
I'll get
see.
The message to him.
What do you think?
Glad to meet you.
No, but about these debates.
Thanks for coming down.
Okay,
Make sure he gets your message.
all
Thank
right,
you.
I'll see you all.
Nice car. Then I tried his office.
Is he here?
He is not here. He is returning from Milwaukee.
No luck.
I'll write my home phone.
Sure.
Is this your pen?
I'm not sure.
Oh.
Probably not.
Looks like a nice one. Well, I don't have a lot of money, so I'll keep this one for our campaign.
That will be fine.
I tried everything. I mean everything.
Rudy Boschwitz here.
No, not today.
Did Rudy Boschwitz call? Did anybody get a call from him? No. Well, if he calls, everybody, let me know. Hey, you guys?
Okay, well, maybe I can find him somewhere then. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.
They say he's in the cities. I don't know where he is. He's not in Minneapolis. They say he's campaigning, then I go to St. Paul. They say he's in Milwaukee.
Rest assured there will be debates on the key issues of this campaign. Look for upcoming dates and places. And in the meantime, if you see a silver-haired gentleman in a plaid shirt, mention I'm looking for him.
Mindy.
Yes, information. Do you have the telephone number of a Rudy Boschwitz, please, in Plymouth?
Thank you.
Senator Wellstone, seeking a third term, was locked in a close race only 11 days before an election that could very well determine control of the Senate.
Many of us are sons and daughters of immigrants that fled persecution. Let the President of China know that we here in the United States of America will always speak out, and we insist that this President of China lead his country toward human rights and democracy. Nothing less is acceptable to any of us in the United States of America.
Perhaps the Senate's most vocal and consistent liberal, he was the only senator in a close race to vote against the resolution authorizing the president to use force against Iraq.
This resolution is based upon a strategy of preemptive strike. This resolution talks about, really approves unilateral action. This is go it alone, and I think it is would be a huge mistake.
But today, even in this most political of all towns, those on both sides of the aisle chose to focus on Paul Wellstone, the man.
Paul was a breath of fresh air. He was unpredictable. He was passionate. He wasn't buttoned down. He said what he thought.
He was the most principled public servant I've ever known. Paul truly had the courage of his convictions. And his convictions were based on the principles of hope and compassion.
An arena overflowing with those who came to remember, and emotions that spilled tears and lifted spirits. Senator Wellstone's legacy celebrated. A video tribute recalled his passion.
This is the state I love. This is the state I represent, and I intend to win this Senate race.
Okay, well, clearly this was a man of great conviction and somebody who believed the American political system was meant for somebody who had strong beliefs. Margaret, do you think that his loss is going to have any impact on U.S. Senate seats across the country, and how do you think it's going to affect Minnesota?
Well, let me start with Minnesota. Today, there was a huge Republican outcry about the memorial service, saying that it had turned into a political rally, and that Republicans had respected the fact that Wellstone had died and had pulled back themselves, and then this had turned into nothing more than a campaign stop. That was a terrible exaggeration, but in fact, the memorial service did have more in common with a celebration than it did with a funeral, which had happened privately a day earlier. Jesse Ventura, as a result, came out and said that he was going to appoint an independent to fill out the term until a winner could be certified in the election, which would throw a monkey wrench into it. Now, Wellstone happened to be ahead at the time of his death. And he is, in a way, irreplaceable as a candidate because he's one of the candidates whose poll numbers went up when he voted against the war in Iraq. He pulled ahead at that time. Also, there aren't many left, and you know, Danny can probably name some joyful politicians in the Capitol. And Paul had that magic. He had an emotional gift, which was he looked like he liked what he was doing. He didn't just believe in it, he really liked it. And he may have known a secret to being a politician, which is if you do good, you feel good. And that's something that was conveyed in everything he did. So now we have Mondale coming in to take his place, and somebody called him, I think Mayor Coleman called him a Mount Rushmore figure. He's quite the opposite of Wellstone, but the only person who could come into the race with enough name recognition and enough experience to pull off a one-week campaign and pick up the mantle, perhaps. On the overall rate, I think that that the race goes Democratic. I think the Senate is held by one seat. I think Wellstone would have won it. I think Mondale will have a slightly harder time, but I think he will win. And so it's still one up.
So you think the Democrats will maintain the Senate by 1 seat?
Yes, and let me add, I do think that the Republicans had a very good point in complaining when at the memorial service Senator Lott was booed. That struck me as a point in their favor and really kind of detracted from the overall joy in the event itself.
Norm, aren't you from Minnesota?
I am indeed from Minnesota, and I actually spent some time with Paul and Sheila Wellstone just a month ago. I was flying out to Minneapolis to do something at the Humphrey Institute there. And actually I was with Vin Weber, another member of Congress who's involved with the Humphrey Institute. But I got to the airport early, and Paul and Sheila were there, and I spent about a half an hour talking with him. This was well before the vote had taken place on the Iraq resolution. And he was, and I've known him for many, many years. I knew him from Minnesota. I knew him from political science before that. There was no agonizing over this vote. It was agonizing over what might come of it. But there was no question in his mind what he would do. Just as there'd been no question 6 years ago when he was in another tough race when he voted against welfare reform. That was Wellstone. He was not, he had had terrible back problems in the past, and now then he picked up multiple sclerosis, a mild form, but he was limping quite a lot and in a good deal of pain, but still bounding around. I was not surprised, actually, that the vote had the impact that Margaret said it did. This reinforced for people what Paul Wellstone was, which was a man of conviction, and I suspect he would have won. I think Mondale will win. The Republicans are screwed in this case. There's almost nothing you can do a week before the election. You campaign and you're going to get criticized. You don't campaign and you're lost. Norm Coleman is just in an almost untenable situation. And Walter Mondale is an icon. He is not quite the antithesis of Paul Wellstone. Walter Mondale, if you think of him only from the wooden performance in the '84 campaign, you miss a person who is more different in private or in small group settings than in public than any political figure I've known. He's funny, he's earthy, he is in a small setting charismatic. I just saw him in mid-September. The two Senate leaders, Lott and Daschle, run a series of leaders' lectures, which have involved so far former majority leaders of the Senate and former vice presidents, who are, of course, presidents of the Senate. And they do these lectures in front of a fairly small audience in the old Senate chamber. Mondale gave a lecture. There were about 100 of us, and about half the Senate was there. And it was just a stunning performance, a beautiful reflection back on his time in the Senate, in the vice presidency, a look ahead to what it would mean for politics. I hadn't seen him look so good in 10 years, perhaps, or be so vibrant. So this is not, I think Frank Lautenberg has some problems as a candidate. He's slowing down. Walter Mondale's not slowing down. He will very likely win this race. And in my judgment, if he does win this race, he has the potential to have a very positive impact on the Senate. This is a man with gravitas. This is a person who can take the adolescent behavior of the Senate, which has gotten much worse, just the petty bickering and partisan behavior, and at least slow it down a little bit. The same kind of effect that Hubert Humphrey had when he came back after he'd lost the presidency in 1968. And if you want to pick another analogy, John Quincy Adams, who went to the House of Representatives for 18 years after he left the presidency. They were both ridiculed for doing this, for taking this step down or moving back, but they showed a kind of gravitas that not very many people have in public life.
Susan, give us your observation of this in terms of its impact on both Senate and House races. Any impact?
Well, I think it makes it more difficult. It's a more difficult Senate race to run. I think the people in Minnesota will have to decide, do they want a candidate who is has a lot of vitality and who's about the future, or do they want to go back to the past? And it is significant the areas where the Democrats have have the new candidates. You've got Lautenberg. How old is he?
78.
78, and Mondale. So
there's still hope for all of us then. Right?
So
with Helms and Thurman leaving, the average age is still going to come down by about 15 years. So.
But
they're still not marriage age for Anna Nicole Smith. So,
so it does seem that the Democrats are a lot about the past. But I'd like to say a little bit about Wellstone. And there's probably very few issues that I agreed with him on. I am, a conservative Republican. But Margaret, I think the reason he looks so happy is because he voted he voted how he believed. And what a burden that lifts from you if you're a member of the House or the Senate, when you just get to actually vote what your heart and your head tells you, and you don't have to look at all the poll numbers, and you don't have to think about every sentence and what kind of soundbite it's going to produce, and you just get to be you. It must make you a happier person. So I think that that was part of his infectiousness that we all appreciated. So I don't know. I think the race could go either way. Who knows? We're in uncharted territory, so we'll see.
How many? Let me just ask you this: can you name me some other politicians who just like being them and don't look at the polls all the time, just off the top of your head?
Other than Dan Glickman.
Yeah, no, right.
I would start with my old boss, Tom DeLay. I mean, he certainly, he always knows where he's going. He knows what he thinks, tries to figure out a strategy to lead people in that direction. He'll take a look at the polls, but I would say I would put him in that category.
Margaret?
Staying close to home here, I would say Senator Kennedy, Congressman Bill Delahunt, Ed Markey, the late Joe Moakley. I wanted to just say, I didn't mean that Mondale was the antithesis of Wellstone, because I was making Wellstone all that is good. I just meant in the race you have, an old-timer who's coming back, who hasn't been in partisan politics for a while, replacing this guy who was, so well known and relatively young, and in the race. And in that way, I think it's quite a departure. And the other reason Wellstone was happy is because he's not representing GE or Dow Chemical or the airlines. He's representing the little guy. And it makes you feel good to do that.
Well, I also think he's the antithesis of all the other Senate Democrat candidates who are all running as Bush Democrats. It's amazing, if you watch the ads of the Democrats, they're all Bush Democrats. So it's really, no matter how the Senate plays out in this election, I would say it's a victory for President Bush, because they're all running as I'm like him.
And others are running as Clinton Republicans.
Yes. It would be a bigger victory if he had a few Republicans who stayed with their Social Security program and decided to take a somewhat different position on prescription drugs.
Saying that, let's show, and I'd like to run these next 4 ads together rather than splitting them up, Anne Marie, if you can remember that, because 2 are from Arkansas. The Mark Pryor, Tim Hutchinson race. Some of you know that Mark Pryor is the son of the former IOP director David Pryor. And then I would like to run the Tim Johnson, John Thune race in South Dakota. And if we could run all those 4 right together, then we'll talk about those for a moment.
Protecting Social Security is not an option. It is a responsibility. To protect Social Security, we've got to do 3 things. We've got to ensure that we don't cut any benefits for those receiving Social Security. Number 2, we've got to make sure that widows and children know that Social Security is going to be there for them. And thirdly, we mustn't raise payroll taxes to pay for Social Security. I'm going to ensure for you that your benefit is not going to be cut. It's not going to be reduced. Social Security is a promise made to every American, and it is a promise that we must keep.
I'm Mark Pryor. Unlike some Democrats in Washington, I believe in strengthening the military, and I support the president in the war on terrorism. I'm also a hunter and a gun owner, and I'll protect the Second Amendment rights of every American. For America to be strong, we also need a growing economy, more attention given to education, and to keep our promise and commitment to Social Security. As your senator, I'll always put Arkansas first, because that's who I am and what I believe.
It's the worst drought since the Depression, and John Thune just hasn't done enough.
Congressman Thune has been a little slow to come into action on some of these things.
John Thune has been a Johnny-come-lately.
And then when the dust settled, now comes in to take all the credit. I'm pretty disappointed in him.
But Senator Tim Johnson is standing up for us. Tim led the fight to pass $6 billion for drought relief in the Senate.
Tim Johnson has been effective and gets the job done for South Dakota.
The tax bite. It bites us hard when big spenders like Tim Johnson keep raising our taxes. Senator Tim Johnson voted 141 times for higher taxes. He taxed our paychecks, our gas tanks. Johnson taxed seniors on Social Security. He even said "I do" to the marriage tax. Tim Johnson voted for the largest tax increase in American history. Tim Johnson. He's the tax bite. Tell him to chew on somebody else for a while.
Look at the facts. Nancy Johnson voted to limit your ability to sue HMOs and hold them accountable. Johnson has taken the most money.
Okay, we'll go back on that one for a moment. Okay, so here you have 4 ads, 2 very competitive states. It strikes me, the first set of ads, you have the Republican in that race kind of running, let's say, I don't know if defensively, but certainly to show that he's protecting Social Security. Obviously worried about the Democratic ads. And the second ad has Mark Pryor with a flak jacket looking like he just came out of an NRA convention, okay? All right. It's a very interesting set of circumstances. And then, of course, the second set of ads reflect this very tight race in South Dakota. Any comments on these spots that you've seen? Norm?
Well, the first 2 were kind of, these are all examples of different kinds of ads that are running. There are a lot of ads that are protect your ass ads, basically. Wedge issues dominate when you are this close. And the objective that consultants have all over the place is to drive a wedge between the other side's candidate and voters, to put them in a position where they have to explain why they are standing with the pharmaceutical companies against the seniors, or with the investment bankers against the old people on Social Security and so on. And to counter that, you try and immunize yourself. So there we saw a classic immunization ad by Tim Hutchinson. The second, the Mark Pryor ad, is an attempt to immunize himself, obviously, against a whole lot of other charges, but also to define himself before Tim Hutchinson can define him. Then we saw 2 attack ads. Frankly, those attack ads were among the mildest I have seen in this cycle. We've got ads out there that are just designed to strip the bark off of people, including an ad in South Dakota that we did not see that had Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden hitting Tim Johnson, that's now been run in Georgia and other places. We had an ad in the gubernatorial contest in Texas that's beyond anything I've ever seen before. 2 former DEA agents basically accusing the Democratic gubernatorial candidate of complicity in the torture murder of Enrique Camarena. It was where we're heading, apparently, in most cases. In the close races, this is what we're going to find. And these races are still very, very close. Although at this point, Tim Hutchinson is certainly the most endangered Republican incumbent senator and is clearly down and is the most likely to lose in that genre. I would say South Dakota is not the race in which Democrats are most endangered. That's in Missouri with Gene Carnahan. But this one comes close behind. The interesting thing, by the way, in South Dakota is that here you have a state with about 500,000 people, less than in most congressional districts. Everybody knows everybody. These are both candidates who've run statewide, who serve statewide. Everybody knows them. 95% of the votes in that state were made up. Minds were made up and the votes were ready to be cast 3 or 4 months ago. This is all a battle for the remaining 5%. And of course, you can run that kind of an ad in South Dakota for about $32. And so it's saturation coverage, and people are sick to death of it.
Do you think it'll have the effect of diminishing turnout?
We're going to have a low turnout election. And this is an election in which people's interest has not been piqued until very, very late in the game. So getting back to Minnesota, by the way, the most interesting thing in the larger sense is whether you get some kind of a surge in interest in those Democratic liberal activists in Minnesota because of what happened to Paul Wellstone, and Democrats are trying to make that happen in the neighboring states. A lot of coverage of what happened in Minnesota and South Dakota, in Iowa, where there's a significant Senate race. What's going to break late? But this is all playing around the two things. The marginal votes, that 2, 3, 5% in most of these states, and whether your voters turn out in very substantial numbers. And we're all looking to see whether there's any kind of a wind blowing in the final 3 or 4 days that adds just enough to get one side's active voters out in larger number and the other one's more depressed.
Susan, I'm just interested, in watching these ads, it strikes me that, in a sense, the Democrats, you can't tell who other than the tagline, you can't really tell what party these folks are from. That was one thing about Wellstone. You never had a question what party he was from. Here you have the Democrat coming theoretically from the right and the Republican trying to protect that senior base. What does this mean? Is there any difference between the parties?
Well, does that really surprise you? But if you look at politics in America today, it's a tie. I mean, it couldn't be any closer. The House, the Senate, the presidency, certainly. And so it is a tie. And unfortunately, or from my perspective, fortunately for Democrats, I don't know what they're running on this cycle. I mean, as far as I can tell, they have two little problems. One is I don't think anyone knows what their domestic agenda is, and then no one knows what their foreign policy agenda is. And so those it's a little problematic. I mean, you would think, I mean, you hear privately that they say that they oppose the Bush tax cuts, but none of them will come out and say repeal it. And so, and then on the domestic, and then on the foreign policy front, they're all hugging George Bush on the war, yet privately they criticize it. And so when the Democrats don't have an agenda, when they don't have anything that they're fighting for, I think that's the kind of ads that you see.
Margaret, do you agree with that?
I think there are Senate Republicans who aren't hugging George Bush on the war. I think a lot of votes were cast quite reluctantly for that resolution. When it goes down to the wire, it's much easier to explain that you're supporting the president in the end, but many, including Senator Chuck Hagel, said how they were doing it with great reluctance. I think of the election or the parties as like a cheap mattress where everyone's rolled into the middle because it's the very safe place to be. And Susan brings up the Bush Democrats, but there are Clinton Republicans. You can't tell these people apart.
Find them now.
they are really middle of the road. For instance, where did privatizing Social Security go? The Republicans won't even say that word now. You can't be heard to say the word. I was in North Carolina, and Senator Elizabeth Dole, excuse me, not Senator Dole.
Not yet.
Elizabeth Dole was running all around the privatizing of Social Security, and now talking about private bond accounts in which you can put 2% of your money if you're under a certain age, because it didn't work. It really hurt her, and so and Erskine Bowles was using it very effectively against her. And even she has now backed away completely from that. I don't know anywhere you can go in the country where there's a Republican running on privatizing Social Security. The other person in the South Dakota ad, in addition to Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, wrapped around Johnson, is Tom Daschle, who's they've tried to turn into a Satan figure out there. I think somewhat unsuccessfully. It's kind of hard to make Tom Daschle into the devil. He's just not the type. In Florida, I think Florida is one of the most interesting races where even the president of the brother is not talking about privatizing Social Security, which actually George Bush still will talk about because he's a kind of stubborn on the issue. That race, I think, you're looking for like a last thing to happen. Today, the more Haitian boat people showed up, and Congressman Carrie Meeks confronted Jeb Bush at a campaign event, and he was caught off guard as to what to say about what to do with the Haitians. And her point is, let us treat them equitably with Cubans and not have if you're going to have a dry foot policy for Cubans, which is once you put your foot on land, you get to stay here. Let us have that for Haitians. I don't know how that's going to cut, but it is a new wrinkle in a race, which is at times a statistical dead heat, and at other times Jeb Bush has a slight lead, and which will come down probably to whether Bush makes his 12th visit there and brings out his people, and what Clinton does, what effect he has when he goes there this weekend.
Dan, two quick little responses, because you can't talk about negative ads without mentioning the Montana ad. Did you all see that ad? Where basically you had the Republican candidate who owned a beauty school, you know, he had his chains on and he looked like he was putting lipstick on another boy, which, you know, that doesn't particularly play in the Montana. That was such a nasty ad, it drove the Republican out of the race. So,
isn't he back in?
Well,
I think he came back in.
Yeah, in, out, hard to know. And on Social Security, the Democrats are obsessed with Social Security because that's that's their only issue that they think that they can win on. If they can scare enough old people that Republicans would take their Social Security away from them, that would, you know, that's what their whole campaign, or at least half of it, is on this cycle. And we should. It would be nice if we could have an intellectually honest debate about Social Security, and actually Bill Clinton had that opportunity, because we all know that Social Security has problems and it needs to be reformed, but nothing is going to happen on Social Security that is not done in a bipartisan fashion, and that's the real truth. And the rest of these ads, you know, they're disgusting ads designed to scare old people, which is pretty offensive.
But you have had about a 35% drop in a variety of securities indexes in the last year, so I think that has people nervous about the whole issue of privatization. There's no question
Dan,
about that.
we shouldn't leave people with the misapprehension that all over the country Democrats are moving to become like George Bush and Republicans are moving to become more like Bill Clinton. We have a skewed sample here. It is the very small number of extremely close races, and as we'll see when we get to the House of Representatives, we're probably down in the 5% range. The reality is that both parties, more in the House but also in the Senate, have moved to become more homogeneous internally and have moved towards their wings. The Republicans have moved right, the Democrats have moved left. Most of the races that we have here involve the relatively small number of moderates who remain. Minnesota was an anomaly there as well. But you know, you've got maybe you could find 6 to 8 moderately conservative Democrats who have become a little more conservative running in these races, and fewer than that of really moderate Republicans in the Senate. And frankly, the numbers are not much different, the absolute numbers, in the House of Representatives. And if we won't see a couple of these races, but you take Connie Morella's district in Maryland, which is, she's probably the most endangered incumbent Republican right now. It's the moderates who tend to be the losers, and she'll be replaced if she loses by a liberal Democrat.
Well, let's see just quickly, because I want to go to the House before we open it up. Let's look at these last two just spots that I thought would be interesting for you. They reinforce a little what we said before, too.
The facts. Nancy Johnson voted to limit your ability to sue HMOs and hold them accountable. Johnson has taken the most money from the HMO industry. Johnson was the only Connecticut representative to vote against mandatory 48-hour HMO coverage of maternity care. Jim Maloney supports the right to sue HMOs, refuses HMO contributions, and supports mandatory coverage for new moms. Tell Nancy Johnson the HMOs can take care of themselves.
He runs his life in his office by the Ten Commandments, and they hang by his desk as a reminder. He believes that a baby is a baby, even if it isn't born yet. And he believes that we have the right to own guns, no questions and no license. What Ronnie believes isn't complicated, and maybe it isn't popular in Washington, but it's solid Mississippi thinking. Ronnie Shaw's Standing on the Promises.
Okay, you think that's funny, but that's two incumbents, in the races, both races, there are two incumbents running against each other, and you begin to see how this whole inoculation and trying to protect yourself kind of makes it so that you really can't identify a lot of what these people are for. And this is the House, which I think is actually more interesting than the Senate. And
having been there.
Having been there.
Yeah.
And I echo what Norm Ornstein said. The moderates are the ones who get squeezed out in these races. In 1994, when I lost, I was a moderate, and most of the people who lost were moderates. More and more we're electing people with very kind of edgy positions on a lot of the issues, and the centrists are going by the wayside because, you know, it's frankly harder to defend your position as a moderate than you were if you just voted your party knee-jerk down the line. But let's talk about the House. Today, I don't know if he's a very good friend of yours, but Dick Morris, that great political leader of the last several years, has...
I think he's yours.
Yeah, but he made the comment that he thought that Bush may be now losing voter confidence very rapidly, like his father did in 1992. And this could have some impact on the House races, even a 1 or 2 points spread. The conventional wisdom is there is no chance that the House is going to go Democratic. I'd like your thoughts.
First, I'd like to point out that that second candidate there was a Democrat.
That's right.
The Jesus candidate. And so he was a Democrat in Mississippi who I think will lose. Listen, politics, with a 6-vote margin, anyone that says there's absolutely no chance that the House will change, I would not put a lot of credibility in their future statements because it really is going to be a race by race. I believe, if I had to predict today, that Republicans would pick up less than a handful of seats, more seats in the House, which is an improvement since we took the majority. We've lost seats every time. So I think we would pick up seats. The Democrats had hoped to be able to nationalize this election. That has not happened. I don't think it's going to happen in the next several days. It really is a race by race battle. I think the Republicans have done a better job as far as running the campaigns. I mean, we have some flawed candidates and they're going to lose, mostly because they're not running good campaigns. But I think Republicans have done a better job of individualizing each race and looking to see what are the relevant issues in each race, whereas the Democrats still kind of run the cookie cutter ads. I mean, if you look at all the Democrat ads, they're all either trying to Enron eyes Republicans or their own Social Security. And I think the Republicans are talking about issues that are more relevant to the people back home, whether it's prescription drugs or economic issues.
Or perhaps calling people very soft on international terrorism.
Or that,
yeah.
Yes, indeed. So I would say that we're going to pick up a few seats, but it's going to be very close. And as you know, a lot of different factors can have an impact at the end.
Norm?
I actually have some news for Dan Miller that he's probably going to be interested to hear. You know, Dan is from Sarasota, and Catherine Harris, y'all remember Catherine Harris, is running in that district. And today she announced she'd won that seat. So it's just very, very good news there for Catherine Harris.
Yeah. And by the way, she tried to declare Janet Reno the winner of the primary in Florida.
And have you asked for a recount yet?
I wanted to send her to Iraq for that election. Maybe we could have gotten things settled there. Susan makes a good point. The Democrats, after losing terribly in 1994, and by the way, one of the reasons that people who try to predict elections should be humble is if we'd been sitting here the week before the 1994 election, along with every other election watcher who followed the House closely, we would have had a consensus that Republicans were going to pick up 25 to 30 seats. They picked up 52. Now, there was a strong wind blowing, but we didn't catch the fact that it became a gale force wind in the final 3 or 4 days. And we got winds swirling out there. We just don't quite know where they're going. But after 1994, Democrats gained back seats in 96, gained back seats in 98, gained back seats in 2000, a year in which, by the way, Dick Morris, I believe, predicted that Republicans would pick up 30 or 40 seats in the House of Representatives. So much for the prognostication ability of Mr. Morris. But to win 4 in a row is extremely unusual. And what's happened is the Democrats picked off the low-hanging fruit and the mid-hanging fruit, and now there isn't much left. Those 2 races that we just saw in the commercials are 2 of 4 in which, after redistricting, Democrats have been thrown together against Republicans. Republicans should probably win 3 out of those 4. Right now, George Gekas in Pennsylvania looks like he's going to go down to Tim Holden. He's in bad trouble. Ronnie Schaus has a shot there. Maloney is way behind Nancy Johnson. And if Democrats can't win those kinds of seats, And in redistricting, they probably fell behind another couple net, so they need to win 9 or 10. You could pick 30 toss-up races out there that are evenly divided between the two parties. So for Democrats to win a majority, they have to win 3/4 of the toss-up seats. This will not happen, Dan, without a wind at their backs. Now, the most interesting thing to me to watch is the fact that the consumer confidence index dropped like a rock yesterday. Stunning drop. Most observers thought it would go from, I think it was at 93 to 90. It went to 79. That's a reflection, a week before the election, of an extremely sour and pessimistic mood. Now, we know that Americans don't blame George Bush and the Republicans for the lousy economy any more than they blame Bill Clinton or 9/11 or corporate wrongdoers, evildoers, I guess we should say. But if people are sour and they head into the election booths, the in party is going to suffer a little bit. And all that has to happen here is a little bit of suffering at the margins of the margins, and you could see some changes. On that basis, I think it's more likely that Democrats will shrink the margin a little bit more, but it's still a steeply uphill battle to get over that 6. And it would probably need to be more than 6 because we already know at least one Democrat in Texas who has indicated that he will vote for the more conservative speaker. So.
Yeah. Let me, well, let's throw it open for questions, and you might think about questions. I do want to ask one final question here. In reading and looking at the TV spots, if you were a younger voter, if you were in this crowd today, I'm not sure that you would be given any persuasive information as to why this election is any way relevant for you unless you take Lipitor and you're almost on Social Security. And why is...
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Now, I understand that it was Willie Sutton who was once asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, because that's where the money is. And so the question would be is why do candidates advertise all these older senior issues? Because that's where the voters are. But is there anything that anybody is doing to try to inspire younger voters in the American political system today? Any of the candidates are doing that you're aware of? Margaret?
I don't want to be pessimistic here, but I don't see it. Well, in a midterm election, you're unlikely to see it anyway because even more than usual, older people are the ones who vote in a low turnout midterm election. So you're going to see HMOs and prescription drugs and Social Security. The undercurrents remain terrorism, national security, Iraq. I think the consumer confidence thing, Democrats have been in the odd position of kind of wishing for the economic news to turn really sour so that it has an effect on the election, and it hadn't, even though, you know, the market dropping 4,000 points, the Enronization of our view of the gods of corporate America. Jack Welch, his 4th wife was born last night. All of that Democrats thought would work for them, but somehow the corporate scandals have passed by. People did just open their 401ks and their other quarterly statements, and maybe that's hit the consumer confidence thing, because I think the market.
They're now 201ks.
I think maybe the stock market has kind of stabilized of late. So with older voters, you're not going to get any inspirational ads out there in a midterm election. Unless, I don't know if either one of you have seen any.
Do you see anybody who is on the offing in the American political system who is for want of better words, either in the Kennedy, Reagan, Wellstone tradition of trying to inspire younger voters? Is there anybody coming down the pike that's doing this?
The one effort that does exist out there was started by Doug Bailey of Hotline fame, and it's a bipartisan effort to try and organize people on campuses and elsewhere to get them each to get 10 people to turn out to vote. And maybe it'll have some impact in a small way. But until we get a draft back, or something that...
universal conscription of something.
Yes, or, you know, if President Bush just in an offhand way said that, you know, to carry out this war we may need to return to the selective service system, That would get young people inspired to vote, I think.
You know, there was a bigger turnout for the anti-war demonstrations this past weekend. Even the organizers today said in the New York Times that they were quite surprised about the numbers. And so maybe young people themselves will stir up at least a debate, which I agree with Susan, the Democrats have not presented the alternative in the most persuasive way, particularly on the economy and taxes.
All right, we're going to go to questions. Let me just make a comment that 7:15 we will finish, and there will be a bus that will leave from the courtyard here to go over to the Kennedy Library. I think some of you will be going out there. And we'll take this gentleman and try to make your question as succinct as possible.
Yeah, my name is Bill McCamley. I'm a second-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School, and at my undergrad institution in the year 2000, I was the president of my student government. One of our biggest things was trying to get young people out to vote. It seems that young people are very poisoned to the political system. They think all politicians are dirty, and they think whatever they vote doesn't affect them. And maybe one of the problems is the advertisements. I watched the news tonight before I come over here, and there were 2 ads that weren't political on Now, and I'd say 95% of those were negative. I would like to know from y'all, at what point in time do these things stop?
The point in time will be when they stop working. And as long as they work, they will continue. As long as they're effective devices for electing people, they will continue.
When does it stop being effective?
When people start voting against people who run negative ads. I mean, it's the old adage, everybody says, I hate negative ads, but I'm voting against that guy because he's going to cut my Social Security. I mean, it's when they stop working, people will stop running them.
Norm?
That's absolutely right. Now, they don't work as well as people think they do, and they don't work as well as they used to, but the big problem we have here is that what candidates have discovered is that if your opponent runs a negative campaign against you and you do not respond in kind, then there will be a word for you. It is loser. Mm-hmm. And so people who don't want to run negative campaigns find that they are dragged into that process. Now, what's also true is campaigns have always been negative, and they have to be negative to a degree. You've got to draw lines and draw comparisons. And in fact, if you go back and look at the kinds of campaigns that were run in the 19th century, we still are not anywhere close to some of those. But with television, there's a much wider reach here. And there's just no question that it has a depressing effect on almost everybody in the process. And I don't know how we get out of it because it becomes a vicious cycle. If you are cynical because of negative ads, then every time you see a negative ad, you're going to believe it because you're cynical.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Richard Palin, and I actually have another question about negative advertising. The conventional wisdom on negative advertising is just what you've said, which is always, well, it keeps working. A couple of days ago at another seminar here, I heard a different explanation, and I'm wondering what you think of it. The explanation is that they're particularly designed to hold down your opponent's turnout. The idea being that if a particular Democrat, for example, has a negative ad about his Republican opponent, he's not going to convince any Republicans to vote for the Democrat, but he might convince some of the Republicans that his particular candidate is such a bad guy, he just won't go vote for him at all. I'd like your comments on that.
I think there are more effective ways that people use, which I think really is unfortunate. I mean, the kinds of the really nasty push poll questions, at least the TV ads, everybody gets to see them. They have a disclaimer to some degree. You know who's doing them. You can make your own judgments. What I think really suppresses votes, and you don't even know how to respond to it when we're doing a campaign where it hits you, is when they do the phone calls and say, would you be more or less likely to vote for Congressman X if you knew that he beat his wife? And you laugh, and you guys, that happens, and it's happened in almost every campaign I've ever been in. It's happened to my candidate, and it just lies, and you don't know who's making the phone calls, and that's what people do to suppress vote, and it's extremely unfortunate.
But of course, there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, that in the sense that in all of our elections where turnout is not high, we don't have the 90% turnout that they have in some other systems. It doesn't make them healthy, by the way, that your differential turnout can make all the difference in the world. So you're going to look for ways to jack up your own turnout and ways to depress the other side's turnout.
Now, occasionally, I'm sorry.
Just going to say, interestingly, this election cycle, the AFL-CIO which really began the process in a big way in 1996 of the so-called issue advocacy campaigns, which were campaign ads under a different guise, putting $35 million into 70 congressional races at that point, this time decided to put their money into grassroots efforts, that they want to focus more on get out the vote drives, and the Republican Party is putting a lot of money now into the same sort of thing on the ground. So we may find at least a little bit of the cycle turning away from the television ads, which are neutralizing each other.
Margaret?
I was going to say, there can be a backlash when an ad really goes too far, as the one in Texas, which uses a Time magazine cover, by the way, of a drug lord, and accuses Tony Sanchez of being responsible for the death of one of these people. That is so over the top that if you are on the, if you're a swing voter, if you're on the edge, you would want to vote against Rick Perry for doing that, because you just know it's not true.
Yes, this lady up here.
Do you think that women will
What's your name? Could you state?
My name is Jenny Rakoski. I'm a first year in the MPP program. And I was wondering if you think that women will pick up any seats this year.
In the House?
Additional seats, right?
Yes. You have Musgrave in Colorado, who will win. In Florida, against Karen Thurman, you have Jenny something Waite, who I think has a good shot at winning that seat. There's a chance that Janice Bowling will win the seat in Tennessee. Let's see, what?
Catherine Harris.
Oh, thank you, Catherine Harris. That one, we haven't had to put any effort into that one.
Shaheen.
Yeah, so yes, there will be women winning.
One of the big places in the governor's race, though, there you will see, in my own state of Kansas, believe it or not, probably the second or third most Republican state in the country, the Democratic candidate is leading by at least 10 points and will win. Michigan, another state where a woman governor.
Ex-beauty queen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Candace Miller will win in Michigan.
Alaska, I don't know. That's Fran Ulmer and Frank Murkowski.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about that race to comment on that. Okay. Terrific.
Sounds like it's coming from Nome.
Let's see, over here, this gentleman.
Yes. It would appear that the Democrats are going to say it's the economy stupid, and the Republicans are going to say it's the war stupid.
They have one thing in common.
Yeah.
Stupid.
Yeah. Given the results of the '92 election and the irritation that Clinton then enjoyed all the economic advances of low energy prices, what do you think is going to happen? I've heard some people say that Bush is really not going to go to war in January. Others people say that it's likely to happen because he absolutely has to get oil prices down to win in 2004. What is your opinion on that?
Margaret, why don't you start on that?
I think January is more a matter of weather, W-E-A-T-H-E-R, in that what the troops need to do and what they need to wear for protective gear can only be done in the cooler months in the winter, and so it's a narrow window. Bush is now in a position, or soon will be, of having to let the inspections go on at least some fig leaf of inspections. And that probably, I mean, the resolution is going to come in the next week or two. Then Hans Blix has to get there, then he has to get his team, then he has to get there. I don't know how we go to war in January without truly ignoring the United Nations resolution. You know, maybe Saddam Hussein has a suicide wish, and it will end up that way. But Bush would truly have to, I think, jump the gun, no pun intended, to get going in January. You know, there's a poll out today that shows that the support for the war has dropped from about 65% to 55%. It doesn't show a correlation with how people are going to vote in the midterm elections, but it's the support is soft, and people in that poll want inspections to be tried and given a chance. I think Bush got the Iraq thing backwards. You know, instead of starting with war and ending up with inspections, he might have started with inspections and gone later. And some of that is, I think, filtering through to people, finally. Not that the Democrats really expressed it all that well, but there is, I think, a softening in that support for the war, and I do think that the country will await inspections.
We actually have a potential breakthrough here that may make all this moot. Saddam Hussein this evening made a proposal. He will let in all the American inspectors we want, absolutely unfettered access, just one small condition, that they all be trained as U.S. airport security personnel. It's called the Ergenbright plan, and you never know.
I have to say, I think George Bush takes this very seriously, and I think he will exhaust all measures. He knows, he knows what he's getting into if we do have to go to war, and based on the experiences I've had, and certainly, you know, he doesn't tell me his plans, but I have
Does
been
Laura talk to you?
Yeah, no, I have been in meetings, and I really do believe this is a man who really, he doesn't care if he loses an election, but he's going to do the right thing on the terrorism issue. And he is going to do what is right. And I have complete faith in Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and the military team that he has around him to do what's right for our country.
Okay. Let me give a serious answer to this. I think the odds are we will be at war in February, would be my guess. Whatever public opinion is now, it will shift depending on what happens in that war. And we frankly don't have a clue what a war with Iraq would do to oil prices. I could make a case that a war with Iraq will bring oil prices down dramatically because you could free up a source of oil fairly rapidly if the oil fields are not destroyed in the process. That is one of the largest in the world and would absolutely put a glut into the marketplace, rather than have oil go to a much higher number. It was very interesting, by the way, a few weeks ago, Sheikh Yamani, who used to be, for those of you old enough to remember, the Saudi Arabian sheikh who was the head of OPEC, who presided over the embargo that caused political turmoil here in the 1970s, went on Al Jazeera and tried to make the case as to why we shouldn't be going to war because it would bring oil prices to $100 a barrel. And why? Well, the reason that he gave was that, of course, the Iraqis would use chemical and biological weapons against the Saudis and the other oil-producing companies in the region, thereby proving that they have biological and chemical weapons. We know the weapons are there. We're going to be going to war very likely unless something very unexpected happens, and who knows what it'll do politically or in terms of geopolitics.
Yes, sir.
Hello, good evening. Another question regarding...
Your name, if possible.
Tom Madonix. Another question regarding President Bush. He's invested a lot of political capital the last couple weeks and this coming week barnstorming around the country in support of Republican candidates, and he's raised an enormous amount of monetary capital for the campaign funds of various candidates. Given the three potential outcomes of this election, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on how it will affect Bush politically and with his 2004 re-election prospects. One, Republicans end up taking back the Senate and hold on to the House. What initiatives do you see the Bush administration pursuing the next 2 years prior to 2004? Two, status quo, House stays the same, Senate stays with Democrats. What happens the next 2 years, if anything? More gridlock? And three, if perchance this gale force wind comes through towards the last few days here and the Democrats retake the House and maybe add a seat or two to the Senate, how much damage does Bush take politically? How does it affect his 2004 prospects? And is there blood in the water?
This is from a statistics major, I think, right here. Anyway, go ahead. Any one of you can answer. Susan, you want to go first?
Well, yeah. I think the reality is there's not going to be tremendous change in the election, and even if we took the Senate by 1 or 2 votes, which would probably be the best case scenario, and we kept the House and picked up a few votes, it's still extremely close. And Norma talked earlier about how moderates are squeezed out. Well, if you look at the legislation that we've passed, it's pretty moderate. I mean, the president's education bill, just across the board. I mean, whatever legislation that's going to get passed is going to be fairly compromised and pretty moderate legislation. I think the most important thing for us is to keep the House, and that way we can at least get something, Bush can get his agenda passed and put pressure on the Senate to get as much of it done as we can.
I would give you the counterintuitive notion that the worst thing that could happen to George Bush for 2004 would be to achieve what he hopes to achieve, which is to win the Senate and have the reins of power. And I will offer you the example of Bill Clinton in his first 2 years. If you have all the reins of power and everybody knows you've got the reins of power, but you don't have the numbers to do what you want, you're in a very bad position. The attitude of the Republicans in 1993 was, you got the power, you're on your own. Not a single Republican vote in the House or Senate for the Clinton budget plan. He went crazy trying to squeeze the votes and won by one vote in each House. Took an enormous amount of damage for it. Several people lost as a consequence. Went on, his own party embarrassed him with votes on the crime bill in the House of Representatives, the Black Caucus. The health care plan was not just done in by Republicans, it was also Democrats. You give the Republicans control here, and the Democrats will have the same attitude, and he won't be able to keep his Republicans in the Senate together. He won't be able to overcome the 60-vote hurdle. We'll have less done than if the status quo prevails. And we probably get more done in policy if somehow the Democrats did capture both houses, because they'd have a sizable stake in governing, and he would have to move to the middle. At the tail end of this last session, when you had a dozen important pieces of legislation up, each of which could easily have been compromised, from bankruptcy reform to patients' rights to the Department of Homeland Security to pension reform. Basically, there was no compromising done. And the White House decided that it had drawn lines and it wasn't going to move from those lines, and they'd be forced to move, and the Democrats would move more than they have if they had to go out and explain gridlock from a perspective of majority.
Any thoughts on George Bush?
If Bush gets the Senate, the one thing we will see him accomplish is in judges. And that he will get, and I bet he forces a retirement on the Supreme Court and gets one there.
Yes, sir.
I have a short question and a long question. Short question, who wins in Colorado? I think it's the Allard race.
The American people.
Strickland.
Strickland.
Allard.
So one American people and one not.
And I don't have a clue. Wayne Allard is not the most colorful or energetic candidate that the world has ever seen. But this is extremely tight. This is a tight race, and it's a toss-up.
All right, my long question is sort of the conventional wisdom is that the Democrats are going to pick up a lot of gubernatorial seat offices. A, is that true? And B, does that matter?
I don't have the numbers, but right at my fingertips, but there is a wave of Democrats coming in. Ed Rendell, whom I happen to know because my son-in-law worked for him, is going to remove the Philadelphia jinx this time around and win by about, I think, 15 points in Pennsylvania, which is a big pickup. And across the country, I think what Democrats are going to get, however, are states that are depressed economically with deficits and trying to make do. It's going to be a terrible time to be a governor. And instead of it being the breeding ground for presidential candidates, I think it's going to be a possible graveyard for potential candidates.
There'll be a net gain, a significant net gain, somewhere between 3 and 6 probably. More significant than the net numbers is that they're going to win big states. And they are going to be awful headaches to govern in. But as we saw 2 years ago in Florida, if you have a close presidential contest, having a governor can make a difference. And
now, having a Supreme Court can make a difference.
Having a governor made the difference that got it to the Supreme Court, and having the ability to appoint other offices down ballot, and it makes a difference in a presidential contest at the margins. So Democrats are going to lose probably some small states. They're going to lose New Hampshire, big. Jeanne Shaheen gives that up, and the Republicans will win in New Hampshire. They'll probably, despite the voice from Nome, at least they're likely to lose Alaska, even though it is close. And they may lose another small state or two. Those are not as significant as what the Democrats will pick up. And obviously, if they pick up Florida, then the headline, whatever happens in the House and Senate the next day, is going to be president's brother loses. That will be the dominant
Florida and Texas, that will be the headline. If we keep Florida and Texas, which is what we anticipate, you won't read anything about it.
Yeah.
Let's see. I got 2 more questions. We'll try to do these as quick as possible. This gentleman and this gentleman.
Sure. My name's Ted Saad. I just want to bring it back closer to home. We have a contentious governor's race here in the Commonwealth. and I didn't hear anybody talk about it, so who's it going to be, Romney or O'Brien?
Well, we did just tell you the IOP.
I can't say the American people will win on this one.
Yeah. The IOP did a poll with the New England Cable Network, and the race is a virtual dead heat. It was, I believe, 40-39 or 41-39. And it looked to me, after looking through these polling results, that the race is impossible to call right now. It depends on turnout and the independent vote. You just don't know. I don't know whether the debate last night had any impact one way or the other. That would be my best way to handle that one.
Right.
Last question right here.
As
Robert?
we move into these final days here, obviously turnout is going to be determinative. And for a number of reasons mentioned tonight, turnout is probably going to be very, very low. I'm wondering if you could speak, though, to which party you think has the advantage in mobilizing voters. And in particular, I guess Texas is the best example. I know the Democrats are counting on African Americans and Latinos to turn out for their candidates. And yet I've read articles this week, I think in the Times, that talk about how African American support or identification with the Democratic Party has actually declined significantly. And Latino voters as well seem to be a population that's up for grabs in terms of their party identification.
If you read more carefully, I mean, it's not as if African American voters are suddenly becoming Republican. There are still overwhelmingly Democrats. Non-Cuban Hispanics are still, by a very substantial margin, Democrats. The problem the Democrats have had generally in this election is they have not been able to get those voters highly motivated to turn out. And in Texas, where they were ecstatic because they thought they had the dream team ticket, an African-American conservative candidate for the Senate, a Hispanic candidate for governor, a white candidate with statewide recognition for lieutenant governor, it hasn't seemed to light a spark under voters, and we haven't seen it happen in a lot of places. I think part of it, frankly, is because George W. Bush is a different kind of Republican conservative president who has not frightened those voters in the same way. That's made a little bit of a difference. Let me make one other point here that I think you all should focus on a little bit. We've already had a significant number of voters turn out, a very significant number, because the trend towards early voting, no excuses absentee voting, and vote by mail is building up an enormous amount of momentum. I think it's awful. The parties like it because it makes their task of getting their voters mobilized easier. You can go to people, give them an absentee ballot, in some cases wait for them to fill it out, so they like it. Secretaries of State love it because it reduces their costs, and they think it increases turnout. We have no evidence, by the way, except in a few local races, that it increases turnout in any significant way. What it's doing is, A, it's increasing corruption enormously, as we saw in Florida, as we've seen in several elections in Florida. We've had, I hate to pick on Florida, Dan, but we've had a mayoral election in Miami overturned because of corruption and absentee ballots. We had an election in Hialeah in the same way. If you lose the protective quality, the zone of privacy of the voting booth, you lose an enormous amount. And by the way, it's big corruption, and it's petty corruption, having a spouse look over your shoulder while you vote, or having people go into the church and all vote together, or go onto the shop floor. It also means that we're losing the appeal, the civic activity, the one you're only required to do infrequently, where you join collectively with your fellow citizens, stand in line, and then go in as an individual and cast a ballot. Instead, it's like a publisher's clearinghouse contest. You just fill something out and throw it in the mail, and you're getting all kinds of people voting long before an election is over. Look at these absentee ballots cast in Minnesota. 2 weeks before the election, 3 weeks before the election. Under Minnesota law, they're going to count them, which means that if they're votes for Norm Coleman, they count, and if they're votes for Paul Wellstone, they don't. If ever you have an example of why voting early before everything plays out in an election is a bad idea, and when people have to vote at different times and voting on a different basis. So somebody, and that means you, has to, and me, and the rest of us, should be thinking about or trying to find ways to stem this tide and get us back to what democracy is supposed to be about, which is turning out at the polls. If you don't want to vote, don't vote. But trying to make this easier for people is not a good way to run a democracy.
I think turnout's terribly important. It's hard for Republicans, too, because what really motivates people to vote is fear. and there is no fear. So we are trying to learn from the unions. The unions have done an absolutely awesome job of voter ID and turnout for the Democrat Party, and Republicans are totally playing catch up. We have a program called STOMP, which is Strategic Task Force for Organizing, Mobilizing People, where we are sending in young people to go into competitive districts and play a role. And I'd like to commend the IOP. I understand that one of the things that y'all have done is send busloads of people to relevant races in this area, and more of that, and we might have more young people interested in politics.
And last word is Margaret.
Two short things. I predict the highest turnout will be in Minnesota, in part because of the not counting of the absentee votes for Wellstone. And the second thing is, when something like absentee voting comes along, the only people with a vested interest are the people we don't, that are organized, like secretaries of state and politicians themselves or the parties. Ordinary citizens don't even know about it, or it sounds kind of okay. I mean, when I first heard about it, I thought, well, yeah, that's not such a bad idea. And it's only later when you see that what's happening is they're eating away at a kind of precious civic activity. I love to vote. It gives you a great feeling to go vote. And so that's the best plea to turn that back that I've heard. And so I hope out of tonight, that's one thing that I will remember, which is that we all ought to go out and stop this move to absentee voting.
Well, let me just close by saying two things. It was Adolph Rupp, who was a basketball coach at the University of Kentucky, who once said, if it doesn't matter whether we win or lose, then why do we keep score? And it always struck me, it does matter whether we win or lose. And people, do spend a lot of time and effort and money in this game, and it does make a difference in terms of the conduct of our democracy. And it is extremely distressing to see the lack of voter turnout and interest except from committed constituencies, and how little interest there has been in recent years from politicians trying to engage young people into the political system, and from young people trying to engage politicians in the political system. That's one of the things we're trying to do here in the IOP, whether you're on the left or on the right, to realize that your lives will be affected by everything that's going on here. So I think these have been this has been a very good discussion. We really have three very outstanding people here. And before we give them the hand, I want to tell you that on Tuesday night, we are going to have an election party here in the Forum. There are signs up. We are actually even going to have beer here in the Forum, which is about the first time. And if that doesn't get young people interested, I don't know what there is. So let's hear it for these three people. All right?